Alright guys, time for another thrilling session of video lectures. I know that these can be a little dry, but we'll get through it, especially on a Friday. But we'll try to get through it. And our goal today is to get through the Spanish-American War, talk a little bit about Cuba, the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, how we acquire a lot of these territories. And I know a lot of this is on your reading quiz that you guys just took, so this might sound rather familiar, but repetition is always good. Yesterday we sort of finished up with Hawaii and Alaska, sort of the last two states of the United States. We talked about Seward's Folly and then the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. And if you remember from yesterday, the Hawaiian Islands had slowly had a buildup of Americans there. They had missionaries. Remember we talked about spreading religion was one of those causes of imperialism. Merchants and planters had established an economic base, and basically starting in the 1830s. And, you know, eventually the Americans, led by business leaders, would lead a revolt against the Hawaiian Queen. And then McKinley and his administration eventually annexed the islands, despite some opposition from both anti-imperialist and Republican and Democratic Party. But really the biggest attraction, and Will and John hit on this in their video yesterday, the biggest attraction for imperialism and the biggest attraction here with Hawaii, if you remember, was economics. The lucrative market there with sugar and some fruits like pineapple really attracted the United States. But there was also that benefit of naval facilities, right, and the military growth. So you had the fueling bases that could reach across the sea, so you could really use the economic strength again in that eager sort of world of the Far East. So that was just a bit of review from yesterday before moving forward into the ever fatter, growing fatter of Uncle Sam. So here you have a nice political cartoon, the Imperial Tailor. You can see it comes with a little bit of foreign policy, comes with a little bit of expansionism, comes a little bit of that white man's burden sort of idea of enlightenment, you know, with his striped trousers here. And you have Hawaii and Puerto Rico on there as well, and sort of some older parts to American imperialism, right? So you have the Louisiana Purchase, you have California as part of the Mexican-American War, and Texas, you know. So this sort of mixes the old and the new of the American imperial experience. Looking forward to sort of the newer parts, like you have Alaska here and Hawaii and Puerto Rico, which we'll talk about here as one of the gains, of course, from the Spanish-American War. So the root of the Spanish-American War is really rooted in Cuba. So Cuba, of course, being only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, is really going to be sort of the driver or the catalyst, if you will, of this war. And the Cubans are not treated well at all by the Spanish. In fact, they sort of go in to destroy, or a monster to destroy, is sort of the idea. Spain is that monster to destroy, because rebels in Cuba initially initiate a resurrection against the Spanish, and they are basically repressed. And you can see here that the United States not only has a geographic sort of component here in Cuba, because like I said, they're only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, but they're also going to have an economic, again, always going back to that main cause of imperialism of economics, to get involved here. We had about 50 million invested in Cuba in their economy and about 100 million in annual trade. So we're going to try to align with these rebels, these Cuban rebels. And this is seen as crucial as well, because it's sort of like the key or the jewel to the Gulf of Mexico. And this has greater importance. Remember, we talked about Mahan yesterday, and Mahan's theory that the power that has the biggest naval power is the one that's the most powerful in the country, or in the world, rather. And so Cuba is seen as a crucial sort of linchpin to this idea of Panama and being able to create a so-called coast-to-coast navy that can function between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. So this really will be crucial for the Gulf of Mexico. This is sort of a political cartoon that gets at the misrule, if you will, of Spain over Cuba. So you can see below, Cuba is on fire with anarchy. Of course, that is sort of representing the civil war that's going on there. And the quote at the bottom says, "The duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain, but from the worst fate." So this really ties into sort of the imperialistic idea, but also we're pretty self-interested. Don't sort of be too caught up in the sort of philanthropic here with Cuba. And don't get me wrong, there is some humanitarian sort of issues here as well, because there will be some really terrible sort of concentration or work camps, and the Spanish are really taking advantage of the Cubans to a huge extent. So here you can see some photos of victims of the Spanish concentration camps in Cuba. So there is some sort of humanitarian element to this, but this is also economic, as we talked about. This is also military. There's a lot of reasons why we're interested in getting involved in Cuba. So one of your terms is yellow journalism. And this war with Spain is going to be one that is almost manufactured to a certain extent through these yellow journalists. So we have William Randolph Hearst, who's pictured here, as well as Joseph Pulitzer. And these two guys are major publishers. You know, Pulitzer is well known because of the Pulitzer Prize. He also is well known for starting many newspapers, including the St. Louis Post-Dispatch. But they're going to use this Cuban rebellion in Spain, which we're going to support, to try to help sell newspapers. Think of this as sort of like a modern-day equivalent to clickbait, right? You always see like those headlines on Twitter or on Insta or whatever else, and you sort of like, oh, that'll be interesting, and then you click it, and it's not nearly as interesting as it sounds. The website Politico is, I don't know if any of you guys read or go to Politico, but Politico is sort of notorious for their clickbait that they have. And this is sort of the 20th, early 20th century, the 1900 version of clickbait with this yellow journalism, because they're going to sort of play up a lot of these things to help people get interested in it and help people read the newspapers. So they almost create the quote-unquote scoop. And you can sort of see the quote here at the bottom. You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war. That's Hearst. So sort of saying, if you give me enough information, I will, be sort of that war hawk, drum up enough of a controversy, enough to create a war. And that idea is sort of espoused here in the political cartoon, where you see Pulitzer on the left and Hearst on the right, sort of putting the building blocks of war together here. And Pulitzer is saying, "Say, young feller, watch de tome. I'm glad de tome, I'm de tome. You can't buy ID. I'm a good thing. You can't push me." See, so we'll talk about the tome letter here in a second, but sort of making that into a national controversy through their newspapers. And then you see Hearst, and I should probably put my glasses on, but it says, "Say this is my war. I bought and paid for it, and you don't stop bothering me about it till I have put it off the earth." You see. And you can see there at the name, it says, "My name is Hearst." So this is an idea of getting at those yellow journalists. And I'm fairly certain yellow journalism is one of your sort of ID, or one of your ID cards, one of your note cards for this unit. So you're welcome. You just got that one finished. Here's another great quote that sort of gets at this yellow journalism. So this is from Pulitzer's World New York. And number one, this is pretty good writing, and you can sort of see how this would stir up some trouble. But let's get to this quote. So, blood on the roadsides, blood in the fields, blood on the doorsteps, blood, blood, blood. The old, the young, the weak, the crippled, all are butchered without mercy. Is there no nation wise enough, brave enough, and strong enough to restore peace in this blood-smitten land? And you can sort of read this as like a challenge, right? We talked about Djangoism and this idea of extreme nationalism, right? And you can see how this plays perfectly into the sort of sentiments of the time, into the sentiments of imperialism, because we talked about a lot of these causes yesterday. But how many of those causes can you identify here? We already have the Djangoism, that's certainly there. Right? You sort of have the militarism is in there, and it's almost like a challenge, right? Are you brave enough? Are you strong enough, right? Are you sort of quote unquote man enough? Sorry, Leah, to take on this challenge. But you also have this idea that comes out from like the missionary side of it, the sort of paternal side of it. We need to go and save these people. There's blood everywhere. It's blood, 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 right? So we got to go in and do our duty to help these Cubans. So the Spanish-American War, darn. All right, sorry. Not only was there a phone call, but it was for the wrong number. How lame is that? Someone calling for Coach Butler. I have unplugged the phone, so if you guys come in tomorrow during second hour, will someone check the phone and make sure I plug it back in, because I might totally forget after recording all of these. So anyway, getting back to Cuba and sort of the sensationalism that was going on in the newspapers. This is just another perfect example of yellow journalism at its finest, or, at its worst. So Delhomme, I told you we'd get here. So we have some other causes to the Spanish-American War outside of just Cuba. One of that is going to be the Delhomme letter. So here you have a guy, and I have to say Delhomme has a pretty fancy mustache. Those Spaniards, they really know how to use that nice, like Don Quixote-style mustache wax. But Delhomme is going to be the United States, or the Spanish ambassador to the United States. And he's going to send a letter that's going to get intercepted that is going to be criticizing McKinley. So this is, if I may take a trip back to world history for a second, this is similar to the sort of Franco-German war that's going to lead to German independence in 1871, where Otto von Bismarck sort of falsifies a incriminating letter to France, where the Prussian king is talking some trash on the king of France. This is sort of the idea here, is that Delhomme criticizes President McKinley, and everything here in italics is a quote, as being weak and bitter for the admiration of the cowards. So he's calling American citizens cowards. Well, Americans don't like being called cowards. Besides being a would-be politician who tries to leave a door open behind himself while keeping on good terms with the Djangos and his party. So essentially he's saying, you're a panderer and you're trying to play to all sides, right? You're leaving the door open to both sides. So the Delhomme letter is sort of going to exacerbate the already sort of tense relationship between Spain and the United States. Of course, as the rebellion, we're sort of helping those Cubans, and we'll get a little bit more into that issue with the Cubans here in a second. But this is going to sort of really inflame things even further. But things are going to reach sort of the point of no return with the Maine, the incident of the USS Maine. So in an attempt to help some of the Cuban and help to evacuate some of the Americans that are there, we will send the USS Maine to Havana in order to help evacuate and help some issues here that are going on in Cuba. But just a few days after it gets there, it's sitting in the port of Havana and it blows up. And it kills 260 American sailors. And this is when the yellow journalists really take off. Because naturally, people like Hearst and people like Pulitzer are going to blame Spain. So that's basically the U.S. public opinion. The public opinion is, Spain shot a torpedo, blew up our warship sitting there in the Havana port, and now everyone is, saying like, hey, this is a declaration of war. But really, this is sort of not necessarily true. When they went into and found the wreckage of the Maine in the late 70s or in the mid 70s, they really found that the hole that was blown into Spain was most likely created from an explosion that came from inside, or not the Maine, that came from inside the Maine, was often came from inside. So they hypothesized, and although this hasn't been proven, that the Maine itself actually blew itself up, that there was some sort of explosion inside the Maine that led to its sinking.